All righty. Want to thank everyone for being here, and we will go ahead and get started. I have the privilege of introducing another outstanding member of our community, Dr. Jeffrey Trask. In May of 2023, Dr. Trask founded the Champaign Urbana Reparations Coalition, located in Champaign County, Illinois, a grassroots movement seeking reparations for African Americans in Champaign County. In the past couple of years, Champaign Urbana Reparations Coalition has been educating the community about reparations through hosting at Reparations Town Hall at Church of the Living God and tabling at numerous events and programs. Dr. Trask was also appointed to the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission, a state-based reparations commission assigned to investigate harms done to African Americans in Illinois. On a national level, Dr. Trask is the Midwest Regional Leader for First Repair, a key nationally recognized reparations organization founded by Robin Ruth Simmons of Evanston, Illinois. In his 9-to-5, Dr. Trask is the founder and current operations director for the Champaign County Christian Health Center, a free clinic that has provided medical, mental, and dental health care for the uninsured and underinsured since 2004. Educationally, Dr. Trask holds a doctorate in philosophy and community health with a specialization in health policy from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he also completed his undergraduate work. In between that time, he earned his Master of Science in Education Administration from Eastern Illinois University. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Trask.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you all here. Excited to share with you today. We're going to talk about reparations, and we only have 45 minutes, so we're not going to learn everything about it, but we'll do what we can. Let that go there. And don't need to go any over that. That's already been covered. But I'd like to start my talks with a little story. I share this with, when I teach my classes and other places I go. And so the story goes, there's this kid named Diggory. He's 4 years old. And one day, he drops his toothbrush in the toilet. And so he runs to his dad's bedroom, wakes his dad up, says, Dad, I dropped my toothbrush in the toilet. So the dad gets out of bed, goes to the bathroom, fishes the toothbrush out the toilet, throws it in the trash can. But then Diggory all of a sudden takes his dad's toothbrush and throws that in the trash can too. And Diggory's dad said, well, why you throw my toothbrush away, Diggory? He says, well, yours fell in the toilet 2 weeks ago, so I figure I'll throw that away as well. And I like to share that story to ask the question, is ignorance bliss? Not unless you like brushing your teeth with a toothbrush that's been in the toilet for a couple of weeks. And I also say that because there's a lot to learn when it comes to the world of reparations. I've been involved with DEI efforts in the universities I've worked in, installing chief diversity officers. I've been doing diversity work at the church I worked at, New Covenant Fellowship, for years, and I've just had decades of this experience, and I have a number of years of reparations, and I could tell you that I'm always learning something new. There's always things that I just don't know. I brought some books here for those who might want to look at afterwards, just to get a kickstart with reparations talk, but we can always learn more, and I always like to try to start this way because when it comes to reparations, many of us have had this image of what that actually is, or may not even know what it is. Some people think it's just one big check that the government should write to black folks and call it a day. Other people have different ideas of what it is. And I just want to encourage us to think open-mindedly about what reparations actually are and how we're trying to go about doing it. I won't get into a lot of these deep psychological things because I think you guys are a little more on the AP side of things when it comes to this kind of topic, so I won't go through some dynamics, but know that when it comes to why we think about the things we do, default thinking, confirmation bias, the cognitive dissonance all plays a role in how we believe certain things. So let's talk about the why when it comes to reparations. Now we know the obvious: centuries of enslavement, discrimination, prejudice, inequities, disparities, racism, lost opportunities in land acquisition, home ownership, employment, education, fair representation, slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, mass incarceration, healthcare disparities, wealth gap. We could go on and on and on and on. Matter of fact, if you trace the origins of the transatlantic slave trade / trafficking, some people like to use trafficking because trade makes it sound legitimate, right? It started way back in, what was the year, 1452, with the Dum Diversas by Pope Nicholas V, who authorized the King of Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue anyone not Christian and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, along with seizing their lands and goods. And they had a couple of follow-up decrees that also was in similar fashion. So the official church actually promoted and kicked off the slave trafficking of Africans. And what was interesting is that there's the Kingdom of Congo at the time. They kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, well, if they're doing this because we're not Christian, you know what? We're going to become Christian. And so the King of Congo made his nation a Christian nation. He even took a Christian name. Didn't work, though. Funny, surprise, surprise. He still, it was a little bit delayed, but his people were still taken and captured and enslaved as well. And nothing I want to say in addition to all this stuff here, I want to highlight the things that we don't know, we don't see, that also had an effect on African Americans, and what I call the coulda-beens, right? How many of you heard of the Bruce family that got land back from California, right? And so there's this family, black family, had land on the California coastline in the 1920s, and the government said, you know what, we want your land, we're going to take it. And so 100 years later, they win a lawsuit and get their land back. Hooray, 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 right? Land's worth $20 million now. So, I mean, the family's pretty happy. Here's the issue, though. There's another family who also had California coastline. It was also providing a place for people to do their vacations. And their last name is Hilton. All right? And so we don't know about the coulda-beens with all the other types of things that are going on as well. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty of why reparations should be an obvious thing. Should be, of course, reparations. No one would argue that the United States is the richest country on the planet, right? You can ChatGPT it, you can Google it. You'll see that the United States has a $30.5 trillion budget. China, number 2, with $19.2 trillion. And Germany is a distant third with $4.55 trillion, right? And everyone else is after that. So no one would argue that we're the richest country on the world by far. I mean, personally, I know we spend about $5.3 trillion on healthcare alone. But no one ever usually don't ask the question, how did that happen? How did this relatively new country, just celebrating 250 years of existence, but, other countries have been around for thousands of years. Egypt and China and countries all over the world have been around for a long time. How did the United States go from 0 as a new nation to number 2 by 1860? It just took 84 years for them to only be behind Britain when it came to their economy. How did that happen? Well, this is called the cotton trade, and cotton industry rather. And the United States benefited so much from their ability to enslave people and have people work for free that by 1860, they were able to sell, produce, and deliver cotton at such a rate that they cornered the market, and 53% of all the money coming to the United States came just from the cotton trade. We're not even talking about tobacco and other products or other types of ways money was being made. Just cotton was bringing in 53% of the United States paycheck, if you will. And that became the financial foundation, the portfolio, if you will, of the United States wealth. And imagine it this way. If I had a grocery store, and my competitor down the street had a grocery store, and I pay my employees, my competitor does not pay their employees. Now, has anyone been in business, your labor costs are your highest expense, usually about 65% of your costs. So if my competitor, that part of their cost, 65%, $0 or barely anything, right? Maybe they get some meager food and some meager housing for their employees, but no paychecks, right? So how do I compete with that? The answer is I don't. It makes Walmart look like, they play fair when it comes to this kind of what happened with the United States here. So we got to think about the fact that not only was the United States able to become the wealthiest nation in the world because of this history, but you think about all the achievements of the United States over the years. Being involved with World War I and World War II, where in both wars, we came in as the superheroes to save the day, World War I and then World War II against Hitler. Well, how did the United States have all those materials and have all those supplies and have all that money to fight these world wars? It's because of that history. You think about all the different ripple effects that the United States has been experienced based on that benefit of free labor. And keep in mind that free labor lasted for 246 years. I mean, that's almost as long as the country has been officially around. The first slave people came in 1619. And it took to 1865, 246 years later, for black people to have freedom, right? So imagine, You know, I took people in my reparations group through this thought exercise last Thursday. And I said, imagine your worst job ever that you ever had. So just take a moment. Some of this should come pretty quick, right? So just take a moment. Think about the worst job you ever had. All right? So you got an 8-hour work day. You can't stand. You're counting every minute. The clock's going real slow. Now I want you to double it. So instead of 8 hours, you're working 16 hours. You're getting up 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you don't get done till 7, 8 o'clock at night. In addition to that, you don't get much of any kind of breaks. You get short meal breaks, but that's it. For 16 hours, you're pretty much working almost straight through there. Because there's no lack of productivity during this time. You know, keep in mind that if you were a slave person, you were working in the fields, you had a person on a horse with a whip giving you a crack on the back if you were to not be productive for any moment of time. So you think about in that game of solitaire, like someone's about to get you, right? All right, so productive 16-hour work days, 7 days a week, weren't any days off, right? You had a little bit of time on Sunday, 12 hours instead of 16 hours, but then that day was used to do a lot of other stuff, so you still had your 16 hours. I was getting to that. So you got 7 days a week, you got 365 days a year, no 2-week vacations, right? You're not going, taking some time off. There's no health care plan. There's no mental health care, right? And like my brother here said, it's all for free. Well, and by the way, you can also get transferred to a different job and be permanently removed from your family and your friends and neighbors and relatives and all that kind of stuff too, all right? So this is, if you can imagine that in your current context of your worst job ever and all those conditions, you know, and it wasn't nice and air conditioned like this building either, by the way. Now, flip that around. What if you are a business owner and you have 50 employees? You have 50 employees working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, no lunch breaks, no vacations. Think about how much you are benefiting from that, right? And keep in mind that enslavement wasn't just the rich plantation owners down south who were mainly the main millionaires at the time, but the wealthy in the north got their wealth from the slave trafficking as well. Banking industry, shipping industry, insurance. They insured people's property, right? So there's other entities making money during this time as well. And so what we have is this nice car, and the kind of car it is, but look nice, so I just put it up there. So in this country, we have a situation where people are able to benefit and have privilege and drive these nice cars. And because you bought this car on pennies on the dollar, it was a great deal. You thought it sounded a little fishy, but it was a great deal. You couldn't pass it up. But you drive around this great car, and now someone comes to you and says, hey, the car was stolen. It wasn't yours in the first place. But you don't have to return it. So what do? You keep it? Do you at least give the person that had some rides every now and then? What do you do? And that is the dilemma that this country is in. And that's why this topic is tough, because we don't know what to do with that. But it's good that we talk about it. It's good to have the discussion. It's good to have that challenge. It's good to kind of process that, because that's what we have to do in order to try to make things right. Professor Sundiata Chachua said that crime doesn't rot. And what he meant by that is that it doesn't matter if that car was transferred to that person's child, it was still stolen, and it still belongs to someone else originally. So it doesn't matter how many generations that situation took place there. I'll pass by this real quick here. So what are reparations? I'd say it would be important to be open to what it is. This is the United Nations universal definition of reparations. How many of you heard the fact that the president of Ghana recently passed a resolution in the United Nations saying that the African slave trade was the worst crime in human history, and 123 nations agreed, 52 abstained, 3 said, no, we oppose that. I give you one guess as to what one of those countries were. So reparations is all about cessation. That means you stop doing the harm, right? You stop what's going on that's caused us the problem in the first place, and you stop doing it. I'm a person of faith, and I teach at a church, and, we have this thing about, turn the other cheek when someone does you wrong. But it's kind of hard to turn the other cheek when people keep slapping you constantly, right? So you got to stop the harm. You got to quit doing what you're doing to cause this problem. You have restitution, repatriation. You're trying to make things right as much as you can. We know that it's impossible to make things totally right, but you got to strive towards that. Compensation, this is where a lot of people get hung up, about the money, and I get all kind of excuses why this is a problem. But if you went to a hospital and they were supposed to do surgery on your right leg, and they did surgery on your left instead messed up your good leg, you probably will be looking for some kind of compensation for that, right? No one's going to fault you for looking for compensation for the harm that was done to you. And so when it comes to compensation, it's simply a matter of getting compensation for harms done to you. When I go to Chicago and I drive down the highway, half the billboards are lawyers and attorneys saying, hey, you've been hurt in an accident, give me a call, I'll get you some money. This is not a new concept. It is not something that we're unfamiliar with, right? Compensation for harms that are done. And in the area of reparations, I would say specifically that we identify very specific harms that are done when it comes to reparations. In the state of Evanston, for example, they identified redlining. And not just in general, but from the years from 1919 to 1969, they had documentation and proof that the city and banks and real estate agents, all these folks were in on this thing about making sure black people only lived in a certain geographical region of Evanston, right? And so if you lived that geographical region of Evanston from the period of time in those years, that made you eligible for reparations. So it's really about being very specific in the harms that are done and addressing those specific harms. The surgery on the right leg instead of the left leg. And then satisfaction is trying to make people whole and addressing the ripple effects, because we know that harm goes beyond the original people that you've harmed. We had all kind of, Joyce DeGruy wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which he talks about all the effects and the trauma that has been transferred from generation to generation, how even epigenetically speaking, that DNA kind of changes through that trauma and that gets transferred from generation to generation. And she talks about all these different behaviors that people exhibit that are examples of the things that they had to endure during that time, being enslaved and afterwards. And you think about post-traumatic stress syndrome, you can get that from one bad event happening one time. So imagine having a group of people having lifetimes of trauma, lifetime of stress. And again, I have yet to ever hear of any enslaved person getting mental health care. And then rehabilitation is making things whole on a generational scale as well. Now here's the other thing that kind of trips me out when people resist reparations. The fact is that it's been happening already. It just hasn't happened with African Americans to any real major extent. But Japanese Americans got reparations through being forced to be in internment camps during World War II. We didn't ever hear anybody in German internment camps, it's Japanese ones. But they got reparations, and no less under Ronald Reagan in the 80s, no less. Native Americans have many, many examples of tribes getting reparations. There's a resource in our website, our Champaign Reparations Coalition website, that has an article, and it goes through all the examples of reparations that have been made and have been done, and there are many examples of Native American tribes getting reparations. And one of my books actually also highlights that as well. Jewish folks who were victims of the Nazi persecution get reparations. And I'll tell you a little story about that one. So you might have heard of this guy named Sir Hilary Beckles. He's a professor from Barbados, internationally known. He goes around the world encouraging countries to start reparations commissions and so on and so forth. I think he was one of the founders of CARICOM, which is a Caribbean reparations group. So he was presenting at Northwestern one day, and he was talking about how he was doing a presentation, and afterwards this Jewish woman who was like 80-something years old came to him and said, would you like to see a reparations check? And he's like, sure, I've never seen a reparations check before, let me see. And so sure enough, this 80-something-year-old woman showed him her reparations check. She was the daughter of parents who died in the Holocaust, and to that day, she was still getting money from that horrible, tragic time. And another thing I'll say on that note is, people say, well, I had nothing to do with what happened back then. I wasn't a person that, did an enslavement, and I even found out my family didn't do any enslavement. But let me tell you this. In Germany, if you live in Germany, if you work in Germany, if you get paid in Germany, and you pay taxes in Germany, guess what some of your money goes to? Paying that Jewish woman's reparations check. So if you live in a place that has that history and has that crime that's done, you're part of the solution, and you're going to be responsible for that. And that's what it is. I have a black colleague from New York who lives in Germany, works in Germany now, and his money goes towards her reparations check. Right? So when you hear that excuse, that reasoning, kind of think about it in those terms. And even people who formerly owned people, enslaved people, got reparations. When they outlawed slavery, there's folks who lost their property, and they got reparations for that. You're a person of faith, reparations goes back as far as biblical days. There are scriptures in the Bible that talks about the children of Israel who left Egypt. But before they left, it talked about how the Lord had made favor with the Egyptians, and they favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for so that they plundered the Egyptians. This is actual translation of the Bible. Like this is really interesting. My Pastor Renee and Trozy at the church, when we use these lectionaries when we do our teachings, and there's some lectionaries that don't even include these scriptures on the time when you're supposed to cover that scripture. They kind of leave that out. And so I always tell people, I think people are worried about being plundered, and that's why we get the resistance for reparations. And so another part about reparations is not just about, the money and all that kind of stuff. And I mean to say this, let me back up a little bit. Reparations can be pared down to two things if you have a conversation with people. One is apology, right? I think we all know the idea that if you hurt somebody or something goes wrong, that you apologize, not a new concept, right? And the second thing is compensation, like I mentioned earlier. But another part about it is the education part about it. And the reason why it's important to talk about reparations, because we can talk about the educational parts about what this is all about and what it means. And so I give this example where Martin Luther King Jr., with that quote there, talking about pick you up by your own bootstraps. But what I want to highlight is the dangerous ideologies that come about when we're not educated about certain things. And in this particular case, I want to talk a little bit about Medicaid. Now, I'm a healthcare person. And so as you know, this big, horrible bill that got passed included cuts to Medicaid. Medicaid is a program for healthcare for vulnerable, low-income populations. Now, what's interesting is that regular Medicaid, not the expanded Medicaid, but regular Medicaid, 88% of the money for Medicaid to provide healthcare goes towards children, people with disabilities, and the elderly who are dual eligible for Medicare and Medicaid. 88% of the money goes towards those three vulnerable populations. While working age adults make up 26% of the beneficiaries, they only take up 12% of the money because usually working age adults are generally healthy and don't use a lot of healthcare dollars. Now the question is, if Medicaid primarily pays for children, people with disabilities, and the elderly, who would want to cut that? I mean, who with a half a heart would want to cut healthcare to those three vulnerable populations? I mean, shouldn't there be outrage that these groups are going to be punished in some kind of way for needing healthcare? But we didn't see it. It got passed, and we haven't seen a big uproar about it. Why? Because there's an overall mentality that the main users of Medicaid are lazy minorities who don't want to work, and they just want to, take advantage of the system and abuse the system. Because that prevailing kind of stereotype and mentality was there, it was able to get passed without a whole lot of resistance. And the funny thing is that they kind of told on themselves that what it was about because they put a work requirement on Medicaid. So it's kind of interesting, too, because there's more white people on Medicaid than black people to begin with, right? So now you're making grandma go get a job at Walmart to keep her Medicaid. So, again, the lack of understanding these ideologies that exist. I'll give you another example. My brother and I, when we were growing up, loved this show called The Dukes of Hazzard. And for those around my age would be familiar with it. And we weren't the only ones. It was the second most popular show in the United States, behind like Dallas or Dynasty or something like that. So it's fascinating that two young black boys loved this TV show that glorified a Confederate South that if they had it their way, we would still be in chains. Pretty fascinating, right? You think about, the theme song, Just the Good Old Boys, driving in their General Lee car with the Confederate flag on it, right? Glorifying this culture that existed that made it seem romantic or somehow it was a good Southern thing where this culture wanted to keep people enslaved. There's this guy they interviewed, and I think it was like 1850, and he was quoted by saying by 1930, we should have about 30 million slaves by then. I mean, they were planning, they were calculating, they were counting up the money, right? This was the game plan. I mean, you can even make a case that some of the reasoning for the Civil War might not have just been about ending slavery and keeping the Union together, but if you think about it, if the South was benefiting tremendously from the slave trade and making all this money, separated from the North, they would eventually become a pretty powerful nation in their own right. And maybe the North started writing on the wall and said, we can't allow that to happen. Another thing that historians talk about is the Revolutionary War, where I'm at it. A lot of people say, no taxation, representation. That's what we all learned in school. It was what the Revolutionary was all about. We don't want no kings. Funny how everything kind of comes around full circle here. No kings. But historians will tell you that part of the reason why the Revolutionary War was fought was to maintain slavery. Because Britain was already talking about trying to end slavery in the late 1700s, and by the early 1800s, they outlawed it in Britain, and it was going to be just a matter of time before they outlawed the colonies as well. And people kind of felt that sentiment. And so there's this idea that if the British maintain their control, they're going to stop us from having, slaves, and we can't have that. The amount of money that the enslavement was worth is off the charts. By 1860, the value of enslaved people was more than all the factories and the railroads in the country combined, and banks combined. That was the value that enslaved people had in this country. They didn't want to let that go. Another thing I want to address when it comes to reparations, and I've actually had conversations about this not too long ago even. Well, we had President Obama, aren't we there yet? Why we need reparations if black folks could be the president of the United States? We got to be careful about the anecdotal side of things. The way I like to explain it is World War II. If you're a World War II person, you understand that the Beach of Normandy was a big event to try to stop Hitler and everything. And the way I describe it is, for black people, we're on the Beach of Normandy, right? We have bombs and bullets and explosions and flamethrowers and all kind of stuff trying to keep us from being able to make it and survive and be successful. Whether that be in the banking industry, in education, in housing, go down the list. In healthcare, we have all kind of bombs and bullets and explosions going off all around us. Some of us just outright die. Life expectancy is lower for black people than everybody else. Some of us get maimed and are not fully whole. Some may make it out physically but are mentally all messed up, right? But some people make it through okay, because somebody had to stop Hitler eventually. They didn't all die on the beach, right? And so you think about those terms where, there's going to be people who are successful, people who make it, but there's a whole lot who don't because of things that are there that shouldn't be there in the first place. When I think about reparations, I also want to think about this idea of measuring the success of it. Part of one group that I'm part of is actually looking at how to evaluate reparation programs and making sure that what is success is deemed from those who need the justice and not from some other entity that's determined what is a successful reparations program. But it's funny because I worked in, like I said earlier, I worked in DEI for a long time. And what's interesting is that we have measures for so many things to see how good we're doing with certain stuff. But it seems like when it comes to diversity kind of stuff, we don't have these same kind of accountability and measures. I used to work at one university where in the 1970s, they had about 4 black faculty members out of, 150, 200 or so. And so we did this thing where, and this is one of the places we had a chief diversity officer installed, but we did this thing where we had all 400 faculty and staff go through this training. We did the Harvard racial bias study, and they had a 90-minute online training. Then we did a 90-minute follow-up group meetings during COVID, so we did online meetings to follow up. And we had these conversations, and one of the scenarios I created talked about the hiring practice of the school. And so one person was getting really upset because they thought they, did everything they could. There's a pipeline issue, and we were fair about how we did hiring and so on and so forth. And I had to highlight the fact that in the 1970s, this school had 4 black faculty members out of all these faculty members. And then here in 2023 at the time, or early 2020, we have 4 black faculty members, right? So, this idea of success should be measured by those who need the justice, and we shouldn't just say we're doing these things, but we should find ways to make sure we actually are doing these things. I give you another quick example. In the world of business, they have these things called diversity goals, where businesses, African-American businesses, other people not represented in the business world should get more opportunity by these companies having to reach a certain goal of minority participation. But the problem is that there's a lot of loopholes on how to get around that. So if you look at the state of Illinois, their amount of money that goes towards black businesses is like 0.1 of 1%, even though black businesses represent a simply higher percentage than that. And so we have to, actually do things that actually make a difference and actually make change. And I will also say when it comes to reparations that it's only limited to our own creativity as to how reparations can be done. Again, it's not just this big check that's given one time. Matter of fact, if I had it my way, reparations would be part of our culture. And what I mean by that is, if you look at enslavement, if you look at Jim Crow and apartheid, if you look at mass incarceration, if you look at redlining, you look at structural institutional racism, discrimination, all those things didn't just happen in some small town in Georgia or a little community in Ohio. These were integrated throughout the entire nation. They were interwoven, saturated even, I would say, into our country. It all benefited, it all was part of the package. So I ask the question, why wouldn't reparations be too, right? Why couldn't reparations be in the 90,000 municipalities budgets that we have in this country, or the 380,000 churches, or the 5,500 hospitals, the utility companies, corporations? Our church here in town, New Covenant Fellowship, they decided to embrace reparations, and what they did, they put reparations in their budget. And what they're doing is that for black folks who would attend New Covenant, their descendants, their kids and grandkids, two of my grandkids are examples, they're getting $1,000 to start and $500 every year for education fund. And they're doing it with 32 kids that are descendants of African Americans that attended the church, it's primarily a white church. And that's what one church is doing, right? And they're doing it in perpetuity. It's in the budget, they're paying reparations like they're paying a light bill, right? Why can that happen across the board? And if I had it my way, there'd be like a AARP or AAA of reparations. You know, we have a black card, you get your hotel discounts, your gas discounts, you know, the whole 9 yards. And I say, like, we try it out, we do it about for 400 years, and see if we close all the gaps, the healthcare disparities, the wealth gap and everything like that. And if we haven't, we renew the lease for another 400 and see where we go from there. But we have to think differently about what reparations could be. Here in town, for example, City of Urbana spent a lot of money to find out how policing was going on in Urbana. And our council member can tell you about how much money they spent on it, but it was a lot of money. And we found out that, surprise, surprise, policing wasn't being distributed fairly. Black people were getting stopped twice as often in the daytime, not nighttime. Of those who were getting stopped, black people were being searched twice as often. And of those who were being searched, ironically, white people were found with more incriminating stuff when searched than black people were. So we know there's an unfairness when it comes to police stops. So maybe what we can do is put a fund at the county courthouse that can help pay for court fees and for fines and for money for compensation for days off where you have to take to go to court and so on and so forth. Again, only limited to our own creativity as to what reparations could look like. And so here in town, we have a group, Champaign Urbana Reparations Coalition. We kind of believe in this idea of EAR, education, acknowledgement, and reparations. And all three are key and important. Because you got to be educated about this thing, because you'll hear every excuse under the sun. You know, people say, well, you know, what if you give black people this money and they just kind of waste it? Now, the first thing I'll say is that it doesn't matter. If we want to waste it, we want to waste it, we should be able to waste it. Because this is how I look at it. If I was a person who was convicted on a crime that I never committed, and I spent, say, 30 years of my life in prison, and then I finally get out, DNA exonerates me, I'm innocent the whole time, I'm going to get some compensation. Say I get $2 million for being in jail all that time, right? Now, does it matter how I'm going to spend my $2 million for me to get my $2 million? No, I get the $2 million because I spent 30 years of my life in a cage, and I was able to have family and get a PhD and start a clinic and do all the things I did for the last 30 years, right? That's why I get it. And it doesn't matter how or why and what I spent it on. And what's funny about that is people's assumptions about money being spent in certain ways by the black community, there's not a lot of empirical evidence to draw that from, right? There's one example in Houston, Texas, where they provide a minimum amount of income, $1,000 a month, but that was for anybody, and they primarily used that to stabilize their housing. But most of people's information about how black people are going to spend money is from a Dave Chappelle skit. Not empirical. You know, so the education is vital. Education is critical. Another thing that I will give up my prison example, my $2 million that I get, which again, this happens. You know, there's a guy in Chicago, police officer in Chicago, that was torturing black guys for years, put them in prison for false confessions, and those guys who got out of prison, they got their reparations for what happened to them. You know, and no one asked the question, well, where's that money going to come from? No one asked that question. When we know things that have to be done and have to be paid, we just know that's just part of the budget. You know, we got to pay for it. That's just part of what our responsibility is. Somehow, when it comes to reparations, all of a sudden, we don't know where the money's going to come from, right? You know, even though we can spend, you know, billions of dollars on the opioid crisis and billions of dollars on COVID and billions of dollars on wars with weapons of mass destruction, supposedly, you know, and that was trillions of dollars, $11, $12 trillion. Even though we can spend all this money on all these other kind of things, when it comes up, when we need it, when it comes to reparations, all of a sudden, we don't have the money, right? It's a priority thing. If it's important, if it's something that you feel is real and is needed, you're finding the money for it. The acknowledgement, I can't emphasize enough, because the difference between good programs and reparations is the acknowledgement that bad things happen to folks, right? You know, because it's one thing to be in pain, right? That's bad enough to be in pain. But it's a whole nother level for someone not to acknowledge your pain, right? It's like salt in the wound, right? And that acknowledgement is so vital, to apologize and say, yeah, we did this, it was wrong, it was bad, we acknowledge that, and this is why we're doing this compensation piece, which is the reparations, because without the reparations, the money part, then it's just words, you know, and that's why you got to do something with that, whether it be money, whether it be policy changes, practices, whatever that is, if you don't have some kind of action to go behind the apology, then it's just lip service. So that's our three things. Our goals is to educate the community, host events. We're actually going to be hosting our next town hall October 15th for Thursday evening. Location, not have to be announced, but that's one of the things we're going to be doing. We feel it's vitally important to continually educate people because, like I said earlier, as much as I've done this stuff, I'm still learning more things. We also want to acknowledge the things that happen locally. This is just one example. We know our County Clerk, Aaron Ammons, have been looking at racially restrictive covenants that affected 774 properties in Rantoul, Savoy, and Champaign-Urbana, where this language that you see here is still written in the actual covenants right now, and he's working towards trying to remove that language. But it literally says, no part thereof will be sold or leased, either in whole or part, to or permitted to be occupied as owner or tenanted by any person or persons not of the Caucasian race. And what's interesting is that, we also have to realize that even when protections exist, voting rights and different things that get passed, for example, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 got passed, and we thought, okay, well now black folks won't be discriminated against when it comes to getting housing. We won't be forced to, be told we can't buy a house. Well, it turns out that President Nixon was the president during that time, and not only did he not want that to happen, but he actually got rid of people in the Department of Justice who were trying to enforce that law. So some experts even argue that the effects of the Fair Housing Act didn't actually start happening until the early 80s because of that. All right, so we got laws in place, things that we have to fix. Champaign-Urbana, I want to jump to this slide here. So this is a relatively recent map of Champaign-Urbana, and the red dots represent where the black folks live. And you can see in different parts, there's some pretty concentrated spots of red in both Urbana and Champaign due to redlining, due to black people being forced to live in certain areas. I'll highlight the North End. North End, for a period of time, didn't even have plumbing. And there's this guy who was interviewed, this dissertation was written, and they interviewed this guy who lived in the 50s in the North End of Champaign. And then they didn't have plumbing, and some places didn't even have outhouses. And so they asked the question, well, how did you use the bathroom? They said, well, we just waited till it got dark. That was their option because that was the only way to get any kind of privacy to use the bathroom because they didn't have services there. And so again, while there's good programming in terms of making sure we have the infrastructure, Champaign spent a lot of money, for example, in Garden Hills to try to bring in sidewalks and those kind of things. But you got to realize that sidewalks should have been there when the sidewalks in Southwest Champaign was there, right? So yeah, that's great that you're fixing problems that existed and now you're working on those. But again, that's not reparations, right? That's just delayed equality in that situation, right? And so we got to distinguish the difference between good programming and reparations, and that apology and acknowledgement is a big part of that. And I will say this finally, there's a lot of movement towards the reparations movement. There are people that are doing the work all across the country. I'm a Midwest regional leader for First Repair. I meet every month in cities like St. Paul, Minnesota, and Detroit, and Chicago, and Kansas City, and St. Louis, and Wichita, Kansas, all these places that are doing work, South Bend, Indiana, Columbus, Ohio. These are just the regular attendees of our meetings that are doing the work. And of course, we got our group here in Champaign-Urbana as well. Obviously, we know the state of Illinois is making movement towards reparations. They had a reparations group that I've been on for about a year and a half now. We created a harms report that got published February 28th. April 25th, we released a survey to have the community identify what recommendations should be the most prioritized when it comes to dealing with these 11 harm areas that we identified. And we hope that by January this next year, we'll have everything in place to have primary recommendations listed with legislative actions to go behind it and get voted on. I'm part of First Repair, and we have a yearly symposium up in Evanston, and this has been going on for 5 years now. In the very first year, they had about 33 attendees. When I went last year, I've been going for about 3 years now. When I went last year, it was over 300. We have 100 municipalities across the country that are making movements towards reparations in some form or fashion, somewhere on that spectrum of that. Then there's also other entities. Harvard University and Georgetown University both dedicated $100 million towards reparations. Georgetown did because they had 272 enslaved people that they sold to keep their doors open, and so they have about 10,000 descendants, and that money is going towards providing care and assistance for that population. And you see these efforts happen all over the place. Even the Catholics, the Jesuits, trying to raise $1 billion for reparations. And then there's examples of victories in Palm Springs where black people were removed from their homes in the 50s for tourism and so on and so forth. They just won a multi-million-dollar settlement a couple of years ago. And so these things are happening, and I would argue that this is a matter of time before you start seeing reparations continue to grow. I see it as the next civil rights movement, frankly. And I want us as a community, hopefully, to be on the forefront of it. We won't be the first, like Evanston and so on and so forth, but we can be forerunners in this effort. And we could be the third community in Illinois to start a reparations commission. And I will end it there. Any questions for me? I know we got just a few minutes left. I guess so.
I have about a myriad of things, but I'll try and condense it. One of the things you mentioned, the black president, Conyers put up HR every year for decades.
Yes.
But the one year it wasn't voted on was the first year of Obama's term, when it could possibly have been passed.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And he said that he wanted to concentrate on health care.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you have some opinions on that. Another aspect of reparations that I think just came to me is that the onerous racist drug war and what it's hard to get new money into the system, right, in the state level. But the marijuana reforms caused that, and they tried to direct the business enterprises towards people who were harmed by it. It didn't work out terribly well, but they can still fix it. So, there. And I had one other thing, but I shouldn't bogart the mic.
Yeah, and I would say, there's a long way to go. I mean, the Democrats have some work to do when it comes to being outspoken on this. They do sign up for HR 40 that gets passed. It started in 1989. We get a lot of sponsors for it, but it still hasn't hit the floor yet. But I remember the recent National Democratic Convention in Chicago with Kamala Harris running. You had all these speakers all week, and not one person mentioned the word reparations. So we still have some work to do when it comes to, whose vote are you worried about losing by not saying the word reparations, right?
Just a bill to study it, too.
Right, correct. And the good part is that, again, like I said, the momentum for it is growing. The numbers of people who support reparations from the 70s to the 90s to now has grown tremendously. We're up to 32% of the population supporting reparations, which, sounds low, but when you consider we're at 14% before that and even less before that, there's momentum going in that direction. So I am encouraged, and I do think that, just like anything else, we got to remember that once upon a time, people said slavery was wrong, and then somewhere along the way, someone thought, I think the slavery thing is a bad idea, right? And so that grew and it germinated into a point where by 1860 came around, there's only 4 countries in the world that was still practicing slavery: United States, and I think it was like the Ottoman Empire, and Cuba, and one other country was still practicing slavery by that time. So movements unfortunately move slow, but they do move, and I see reparations as one of those movements.
With the assault on DEI, I'm surprised. So do you see that reversing in any way? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is
Right.
Yeah.
We make a point efforts from reparations, and it all deals with the specificity of the harms, right? DEI are more kind of global general programming to kind of acknowledge all the problems of the past and try to fix them in a global fashion. That's what the courts have been fighting against. But when you look at reparations and you talk about the specificity of it, it's hard to dispute that part of it. So even the lawsuit that we have going on in Evanston, which is pretty ridiculous, but they can't argue the specificity of the harms. So what they're actually trying to do, they're trying to say, well, white people should get reparations too. That's their angle for that one. But yeah, that's a distinguishing characteristic. And what you got to realize is that if we focus on our harms, there are cases where we don't even have to say this is just for black people, because only black people were harmed in this way, right? So you deal with the harms, then you kind of cover your bases, and you cover yourself legally as well.
Piece. I was wondering with the new educational whitewashing the history, how do you think that's going to impact your, movement of reparations?
Point. Responsible for the curriculum, and I'm proud to say that here at Illinois, I was actually part of a team that put together a curriculum for middle schoolers that African-American history, and they actually asked me to write a piece on reparations, and they actually did like a big presentation about that not too long ago. So here at Illinois, we're not whitewashing it, and students are going to be able to hear the history, but down south and some other places, yeah, that's going to be more difficult. But of course, down south is probably going to be one of the last places to do reparations to anyway, right? So, you know, we can keep fighting that as much as we can, but it's going to really kind of come down to each state taking responsibility to educating their folks.
So I do a radio show on Thursday nights, and I try to talk a lot about mutual economy for mutual society and a mutual relatedness ecologically, as opposed to imperial economy and colonization, all that. So what occurs to me, and of course equity, building equity, and you know, and paying back reparations for equity is part of that. The aspect of taking somebody away from their homelands, and the equity that would come from that, you know, I wonder how much that has been explored.
In terms of the kidnapping of Africans in the first place?
Right. I wonder, I mean, it just seems like part of the conversation that we're not covering too much, that maybe could be covered more.
Yeah, and that's a tricky one because, you know we can kind of pare down the economic value of all the free labor, for example. So there's been some, you know, multi-trillion-dollar labels placed on if people got paid during all that time, what that might look like, which also does not include how that money could have grown over time either. But in terms of that specific part of the value of the kidnapping and what that means, you're right, there's not a lot of, you know, value in terms of dollars, how we quantify that in any kind of way. I would say that as a whole, the African diaspora has been being more united in terms of kind of acknowledging that this is a global thing. I mentioned the United Nations piece already, but the continent of Africa as a whole has declared this decade as a decade of reparations. The Caribbean also has their own reparations group. So there is a growing kind of development of those kind of things, and I think it's going to happen. But it's a tricky one because, you know, how do you quantify, you know, those kind of things?
We're actually out of time. Okay, real short one.
Real quick.
Jeff, could you bring us up to date on what's happening in the city councils for Urbana,
Yes.
Champaign, and what we're trying to do?
Yes, great question. Point. So City of Urbana, Mayor Deshaun Williams has already supported and approved us forming a commission with funding. We're going through the processes now, working with the city attorney and the staff to finalize the language so that it can be passed officially by the council. But that's pretty much in place. We also have the ordinance passed with the Champaign County Board. They had a 15-6 vote in favor of forming a commission with funding as well. And so those groups are going to be getting started right away. We just got through meeting with all the Champaign City Council members. They have different processes. They may ultimately have their own commission at some point in time, but all that's been in the works as well. So we hope that the City of Urbana County one will get started relatively soon, probably sometime this fall, and then we'll get into the Champaign. They can either join that group or they can start their own thing, either way. But I feel pretty good about something happening there too. Yeah. Thank you. If you want any resources, take a look here too.